A reading from the life of Jesus from the book of Matthew, chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
So it's the last year of Herod the Great's terrible and terrifying reign over Judea. He's not only sick and dying, but his mind is being driven mad by what most historians, scholars think was probably gonorrhea. Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and I am sure you were not expecting the last sermon in the Christmas season to start with the word gonorrhea. But here we are. Now, here's why this matters. This story that we just heard read is really a story about two kings. And maybe better yet, it's a story about one king and a madman who thought he was king. Herod had been appointed, but he was really just a puppet king of the Roman government over Judea. He was petty, he had a lot of power, and his insecurity mixed with his constant paranoia of rivals to the throne and a possible illness that was eating away at his mind, led him to basically be suspicious of every threat to his rule. He was a volatile and terrifying ruler over the Jewish people. Herod was violent whenever he started to think maybe someone was coming after his throne, to the point that he'd already killed one of his wives. He'd killed her mother, which some people are like, okay, maybe. But he'd also killed 3 of his own sons. In fact, it led to a point, he was so narcissistic that Augustus Caesar had once said, it's better to be one of Herod's pigs than it is to be one of his sons. He'd ordered that on the day of his own death, because he knew the Jewish people would be happy, he ordered that several other beloved Jewish leaders had to be executed so that there'd be mourning on the day of his death. He was power hungry and lustful. He had at least 9 wives. As scholar Warren Wiersbe says, it was to fulfill his lusts and strengthen his political ties. And now on top of all of that, he's weak and he's driven to madness. And we're told this by Matthew. During the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where's the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him." And when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. And note this last part. And all Jerusalem was disturbed with him. Now, when you hear about who Herod was, it's not hard to imagine why there would be this kind of fear that struck in the heart of people in Jerusalem when they hear that Herod was disturbed because someone else is about to be king. You have no idea what he's going to do, and you have no control over what he might actually go out and do. And the outcome we find out in the next story in Matthew is that Herod orders the death of every baby boy under the age of 2 in the town of Bethlehem. And some scholars put that as about between 12 and 18 children were killed. He was ruthless and brutal and cruel in order to maintain his control. Now, we don't have the kind of power Herod had. But I want you to think for a moment as we're imagining all of this. What do you do when your life and your control over your own life starts to feel a little threatened? In moments where there's a threat to you or to people that you love, but you have no control over the situation, what happens in your heart? What kind of disturbance gets brought out in you? I know many people who were very happy about the results of November's election, but I know many people as well who were heartbroken and fearful over the future. What does that mean for me? What does it mean for people that I love? But let's be honest, none of us have any control over an election, right? You have one vote, but what do? Where does your heart go when things don't go the way you want them to go? Does it go somewhere dark? Does it go somewhere fearful? Do you get filled with dread and anxiety? Or maybe you get filled with anger and hatred towards the people that you've now decided are a threat to the story that you wanted for yourself. Now, maybe it's not a national election. Maybe it's closer to home. What do you do when you feel like your job is threatened? And maybe by your poor choices, or maybe by the poor choices of other people. And you had no control over what they're going to do. What do you do when your health is under threat? And there's nothing you can do. You did all the right things, and suddenly there's a diagnosis, and you have no control over the outcome of it. What do you do when there's a situation in your family that is outside of your control? I mean, you can control your own behavior, but the crazy thing about family is they get to control their own behavior. So what do? I mean, this is the one thing, it didn't take me very long to learn about parenting, is that having a child is like having an exposed nerve that gets to walk around and bump into things and hurt themselves. And when they get hurt, you get hurt. In fact, every parent in the room can probably relate to the idea that often your children's bad decisions hurt you more than they hurt them. So what do you do when they're making those decisions? What kind of disturbance goes on in your soul? Where do your hands reach out to grab control and to try and say, stop hurting yourself so you can stop hurting me? Where do you go? What places does your heart go to when you receive news that threatens the life that you have worked really hard to make for yourself? For Herod, that disturbance in his soul led him to grasp for control by any means necessary. His throne and the life that he had carefully crafted for himself was being threatened. He could not let that slide. So what does he do? He calls together all of these scholars and religious leaders in Jerusalem that were advisors for him, and he tells them, hey, what's going on in this situation? For some reason, and we don't know exactly sure, but he seems to suspect, at least when they say they're coming to worship the one to be born King of the Jews, he suspects they're talking about the coming Messiah. And that's a real problem for Herod. And so he gathers them together to find out, where is this Messiah supposed to be born? And that's not just a threat to Herod's throne. It feels like a personal attack to him. See, Herod was appointed by Rome as the king of the Jews. But he knew that the people did not see him as the rightful king of the Jews. First, Herod wasn't Jewish. So they already didn't see him in the same way as everyone else. See, Israelites, the Hebrews, they're people who descend from Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson. And that's their family line, is they are Israelites because they come from Jacob's line. Herod was not an Israelite, he was an Edomite, which descends from Esau, Jacob's brother's line. So closely related, but not the same. So even though Herod followed the Jewish laws and customs because he was trying to win over the people never saw him as the rightful king. It was always a thorn in his side. It was always part of his jealousy. He was Rome's king, not the king of the Jews. And God's king, this Messiah that had been long promised, would not only descend from the line of Jacob, he would specifically descend from the line of King David. And David was the most famous, most prosperous king in Israel's history. And God had promised David that his family would sit on the throne of Israel for all generations. This is part of kind of their long history leading up to the Messiah. But because of a lot of other history that had happened, including civil wars and exile to other countries, there had not been a king from the line of David on the throne of Israel for hundreds of years. But still, there were these people. We talked about this the first week, this faithful remnant of people that were waiting for this long-promised Messiah, this future son of David that would not only rule over Israel, they believed he'd rule over the whole world as God's king, his Messiah. And they knew that's not Herod, but that's who the Magi have come looking for.
Now, even without their message of the newborn king, the sheer presence of these Magi from the east would have been a threat to Herod. Herod had been paranoid about the threats from the east, particularly from Persia, throughout his reign. He'd built fortresses along his eastern border to protect against invasion. And so when these Magi arrive in Jerusalem, Herod's got red flags going off left and right. Maybe because there were probably more than 3 of them. You'll need to drop the lyrics of "We Three Kings" out of your mind. The Bible never says how many Magi there are, and they're never called kings. The Magi are an order of royal advisors from as far back as the Babylonian Empire. They were a group of scholars and astrologers who not only studied the stars and magic, but also interpreted dreams and ancient wisdom to advise kings. And hundreds of years before, the people of Israel had been conquered and taken in captivity by the Babylonians. So as author Michael Card says, owing to the presence of the exiled Jewish community in Babylon during the captivity, the Jewish scriptures had become part of the Magi's vast accumulation of knowledge. So probably through a mixture of studying the stars, since the Magi say they saw the star of the King of the Jews when it rose, and through interpreting the Jewish scriptures, the Magi have determined that this long-awaited King of the Jews was about to be born. And perhaps they knew this king would have greater importance beyond Israel. Because as one ancient Roman historian, Suetonius, claims, an ancient superstition was current in the East, that out of Judea at this time would come one of the rulers of the world. So an unknown number of these Magi, and perhaps a group of Persian soldiers, set out towards Jerusalem with the intention of finding this king and worshiping him. But Herod is disturbed by this. Maybe he's worried that this new king would strike up an allegiance with these Magi and come to war against him. Or maybe he's afraid of the people joining this Messiah and rebelling against him. Either way, it's clear that Herod's intention is not what he tells the Magi. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." But Herod had no intention of worshiping this newborn king, but destroying him. Now, what's strange is that Herod doesn't send his own advisors or religious leaders of Jerusalem to Bethlehem to find this child. Perhaps he wants to keep it secret for fear that these religious leaders would turn on Herod and follow this Messiah instead. Or maybe Matthew is trying to make a point about the hearts of the religious leaders. They knew where the Messiah would be born. They're the ones that told Herod where the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. They knew where the Messiah was, but they couldn't be bothered to go get him. So instead, it's these outsiders to the faith that most passionately pursue him. These Magi set out from Jerusalem and head about 5 miles south to the little town of Bethlehem. And as they get closer, they see the star they had seen in their homeland again. This time, it's leading them to the place where the child was born. And when they find him, he's no longer a baby. I know, your nativity set tells you that the Magi show up at the birth of Jesus, but it's actually about 2 years later.
You sit on a throne of lies. Look, I'm not kidding. You're a fake.
And when they see him, we're told, they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are expensive and precious gifts. the kinds of things only meant for people of high value: gold for a king, frankincense and myrrh, which were valuable perfumes and incense. And several scholars mention the symbolic meaning of these two, frankincense being the only incense allowed to be burned on the altar of the temple of God, which recognizes Jesus' role as the great high priest of God, and myrrh being something used in embalming bodies after death, recognizing that Jesus would come into his kingdom through his death, inaugurated with a crown of thorns and a purple robe to tear open his wounds on his back. Unlike Herod, who protected his throne through killing his enemies, this king would provide for his people by giving his own life for them, allowing his enemies to kill him. When this king was threatened, his heart went to love. It rested in the love of his Father, and he poured that love out for all people, even those who would kill him.
So here in our community each week, we come together and honor, we just heard spoke of, the death of Jesus for us on the cross. And we do that by eating and drinking the meal known as the Lord's Supper. We use bread to help us remember Jesus' body given for us, and juice for his blood poured out for us. And when we eat and drink, we're not just thanking God for the forgiveness of our sins or for the gift of new life given through Jesus. We are also honoring the kind of king that Jesus is. See, we remember that before we ever gave our lives to him, he gave his life for us. Jesus led the way for us to show us what life is about. He led the way in living sacrificial love for us. And now it is our honor to follow that example and do the same. So today, as we eat and drink, we draw near to Jesus and we ask that he might help us to follow his example so that we might live as people marked by self-sacrificial love. So today, when you walked in the door, you were handed symbols that look like this. And in this container is the bread and the juice that we will use to remember Jesus. And in a moment, our band is going to begin to lead us and sing a song praising Jesus for the kind of king that he is. And I just want to say, for those of you who are here and maybe you don't believe that yet, you're still trying to figure that all out, please don't feel obligated to participate in the way that we do. You don't have to eat or drink. Maybe you feel a bit like the Magi in our story today. See, they were foreign to the people of God. They had only just studied the faith of Israel kind of from a distance. They didn't always have all the proper beliefs. In fact, they had even practiced other religions. But because they were open to encountering God, God met them right where they were. And he began to lead them to come and to worship his son. So if you're in a place where you're not sure exactly what you believe, maybe you could just start there. Just be open. Maybe use this time to offer a prayer to God and tell him that you are open, that you want to encounter him. I believe he wants to encounter you. He wants to make himself real to you. But for us who believe, I want to invite you to use this song that you're listening to honor Jesus. And while you listen, eat and drink the Lord's Supper. And when you're ready, join with us in singing about our King who reigns from a manger throne.
So let's talk about how this story that we've been looking at today intersects with our little Christmas this year. Throughout this series, our goal has been we want to prepare our hearts to not only encounter Jesus, but to love him even more. Often this season, which is intended for us to worship Jesus, becomes so busy and so hurried as we're trying to make it bigger and more meaningful each year. We end up making the story all about us. As if what this story was primarily about what God did for me and not what God did and just who God is. We get caught up in the muchness and the manyness of Christmas that we often forget about the smallness of Christmas. That it is not about Jesus coming in power and glory like Herod in his great palace. It's about him ruling from a manger throne. The point of the Magi story in the Scriptures is that all of the people who were supposed to notice that the Messiah had come failed to notice. The people who were supposed to be leading the people in worshiping the coming of the Messiah, the priests and the religious systems who sent the Magi off to go find him. The king of Israel who was supposed to lead the people to come and worship and bow down to the Messiah. They all failed to do so because they were all caught up in their own plans. It was only the outsiders who actually treasured the king in the manger throne. And Herod, in all his power and authority, where he could shape his story, he could shape everything to go the way he wanted it to, in the end had no control over his story, because none of us would know the name of Herod the Great any more than any other ancient king you know the name of, if he weren't a footnote in the story of the King of Kings. I think the challenge to us is when our story feels out of control, is to not respond like Herod with trying to get control. It is to respond like the Magi and to worship. Here's what I mean. When you feel like the life you have carefully planned and crafted is threatened, where does your heart go? What's the natural posture of your soul when your family is not turning out the way that you thought it would? Or your career is going off the rails, or your Christmas this year is going to be more difficult than anyone would want it to be. Do you, like Herod, try to reach out and control and manipulate? Does your heart fill with love for the people in your life, or do you start to see them as problems to be managed? Are they just people who need to be convinced to start to see things your way? Or are they opportunities for you to love God by loving and serving them? Herod responded to threats one way, and we know what that is. But you know, the Magi also were threatened. And they responded a different way. We think of it as Herod's the only one who has a threat in this situation. But this could have been very disturbing news to the Magi, just as it was to Herod. These Magi are not Jews. And so a king of the Jews being born who might, as they know, become a ruler of the world one day, that could be bad news for them and for their nation. They don't see it as a threat. They're filled with wonder. They welcome it as an opportunity to go and worship a newborn king. So what if when something unexpected happens in your life and you start to feel like this is a threat to the story that I always wanted to have? And you start to wonder, what if my life is not going to be what I thought it was? What if my family? What if my marriage? What if my career? What if my kids' future? What if this country's future is not what I thought it would be? What if that disturbance to the way you thought your story would go, what if that disturbance did not have to disturb your soul? What if you chose instead to see it as an opportunity to worship the King of all kings? And I know that feels like the kind of Christian nonsense that only a pastor could get away with saying at Christmas time. But I think that's because we don't often think of worship in the right way. I get what you just heard me say is that when your marriage or your family is falling apart, just go through a chorus of how great is our God, everything will turn out fine. That's not what I said. Worship is not primarily singing. Worship is a posture we take in our life. It is a choice to honor or to value or love someone or something as greater and more important than ourselves, as the meaning and the purpose of our lives. Worship is you choosing to remember what we've been saying all year long. This life is not a story about you. and how you get this story to go the way you always thought it should go. Life is a story about Jesus. And my ultimate meaning in this life does not come when I get the story to go the way I wanted it to go. When I get the story I always dreamed of. My ultimate meaning in this life comes when my story gets wrapped up in the great story that Jesus is telling throughout history. So much of what we think Christianity is has gotten reduced down to what you believe or even what you do. And somehow we've forgotten it was primarily, first and foremost, about who you love. Who is it do you love? Who is it, as we sing around here at Christmas time, do you adore? Where does your heart go when you're disturbed? Christians are people who are learning to adore Jesus above everything else, including the stories we wanted for ourselves. We are learning how to love Jesus well. Worship is the posture of these magi who bring their treasures and lay them open at the feet of the King. Though once I treasured my story, though once I treasured my dreams and my family and my marriage and my life going as the way I thought it should go, I treasure you more than anything else in this life, so you get to have it all. As we've been singing this whole season, my life, my praise, everything I own, I give to you, the King of all kings who's reigning from a manger throne. I could try and manipulate those things. I could try and make those things go the way I want them to go. I now realize those things were never meant for me. They were opportunities for me to learn how to love you well. My relationships are not things that exist primarily so I don't have to be as lonely as I once was. These are people who are blessed gifts, opportunities for me to love you by serving and forgiving and honoring them. My talents and my abilities and my money, these are not resources for me to leverage to get the kind of life that I thought I should always have been living in the first place. They are opportunities to bless God by blessing other people. Maybe you feel like you don't even have much to offer Jesus this season. Maybe you feel so empty and so broken, or that you've done so much that you have nothing to offer. But that is the point. We don't have anything to offer. None of us have anything to offer Jesus that's of much value. I mean, no matter how spiritual or mess-free you've tried to make your life, or at least try to make your life look, you do not impress God. I mean, come on. The gifts that they brought, you think Jesus as a baby was excited about gold, frankincense, and myrrh? It wasn't the gifts. It wasn't the point of the gifts. What He wants are people whose hearts are fully surrendered and fully open to Him, no matter how empty or small your heart may feel. Which is why the act of singing, which is why the act of prayer, the act of communion are so important, because when my heart feels empty and I feel like I have nothing to offer, my body going through the routine of it can remind my heart what I know to be true. When I fill my lungs to sing or I raise my hands in prayer, I do not often do these things because I'm really caught up in the moment and I really got to feel something. It's because I need my body to get into a place to remind my heart what I said was true, that I love Jesus and that He matters more to me than anything else. When I eat the bread and I drink from the cup, I am remembering it is not the fact that I offer anything to God that matters. It is that He loved me first. And my heart then raises to Him. Every day I pray the Lord's Prayer word for word, because some days I don't have any words that are worth anything. But I know those words matter because He told me, say these to me. And when I put my body in postures of worship, often my heart will follow, even when my story that is going on is failing all around me. Right now, many of us in this church, and we as a church, are living in a season, living a story none of us would have chosen for ourselves. For ourselves, for our community, for people that we love. There is a lot of hurt and confusion and fear for the future. But I hope that you have experienced what I have experienced, that when we join together, and even though there are difficult emotions that we have to work through, and there is all this baggage that we carry, when we collectively fix our eyes on Jesus, everything changes. Because I'm reminded, though my story and maybe our story seems really shaky at times, His story is never shaky. God is still God, and God is still good. And when I sing about His loving character, and I eat the bread, and I drink from the cup, and I experience how sweet it is to be in His presence, and when I have a moment of prayer where I draw near to Him, all of this reminds me He is what I have treasured the most. And then I lift my eyes to you, my brothers and my sisters, and I remember that we are what He treasures. And I see Him in you. And I hear Him in your words. I feel Him in your embrace. I listen to Him sing over me as sometimes I can't sing, but you sing over me. And I feel a presence that is more powerful than the pain and is louder than the doubts and the questions we carry. And it fuels me to continue loving Him and serving Him by loving you and serving you and allowing you to love me and serve me. And somehow together, in the midst of all of that, just walking that circle again and again, together, we all get caught up in the eternal life, the eternal loving community of Father, Son, and Spirit. And it is more worthy of anything we could give our lives to than anything else we could find. And so if for whatever reason, your story or your Christmas feels less than or littler this year, maybe there's someone who won't be there this year. That was harder to say than I thought it was going to be. Or maybe there's something going on that's causing it to be a little messy. And you're just afraid that the Christmas feeling's going to be little this year. Don't let your heart be disturbed. Let your heart be full of worship for the God who also became little as a baby boy in a manger. The love of God that is so powerful that it shaped the stars and it shaped your heart has become little enough He could reach you in this moment. And would you meet Him in your little Christmas this year, no matter how little your life feels right now? Bring your little gifts to Him and worship Him. That's what we're going to do right now. Jason's going to come and lead us in this.